I was not supposed to feel anything the day the throne trembled. I had sat upon that stone seat for longer than the oldest tree in this kingdom had drawn breath. And nothing, not armies, not gods, not the slow erosion of centuries, had ever made it move. The throne did not tremble. That was the first law of my world. The second was simpler. No one looked at me. Not truly. Not without the armored shield raised between us. Not without the closed eyes of the wise men who petitioned me by memory alone. Not without the servants who learned to speak to the floor, to the wall, to the air beside my left shoulder, anywhere that was not my face. I had built my reign on the fact that to see me fully was to be destroyed. So when the child walked in, barefoot, dress torn at the hem, clay still drying on her knees from where she had fallen in the courtyard, and looked directly into my eyes without a single flicker of fear crossing her face, I understood that something fundamental was about to break. I did not know yet if it was her, or the throne, or me. She was not brave. She was not a weapon sent by my enemies, though they would later claim she was. She was not a prophecy walking on small feet. She was simply a child who had not yet learned that I was supposed to be terrifying. And that absence, that one clean, uncorrupted gap in what she had been taught to fear, cracked the foundation of everything I had built. The throne trembled because truth, when it finally arrives, does not knock. If this story pulled you in, like the video and follow Medusa's Memories. Tell us, what state are you listening from? Let me tell you about the morning everything began, because beginnings matter even when you can only recognize them in reverse. The kingdom of Threenes had not seen a natural dawn in 43 days. This was not unusual. I had grown accustomed, over my long reign, to the sky performing its moods in concert with my own, and I had been in a dark mood for longer than most citizens of this realm had been alive. The cloud cover was permanent, thick as wool fleece, the color of iron left in rain. The farmers had learned to plant by instinct rather than light. The fishermen navigated by memory. Children were born in this kingdom who had never seen the sun and considered it a rumor told by elders. One of those stories grown-ups invented to explain something they themselves no longer understood. I did not feel guilty about the sky. I want to be clear about that. I felt many things in those years. A low, persistent ache that I had stopped naming, a hunger for something I could no longer identify, a weariness that had settled into my bones the way moisture settles into old stone. But guilt was not among them. The sky was dark because I was dark. That was simply the arrangement. My court convened at the 5th bell each morning, which in those sunless days meant nothing more than a sound and a habit. The great hall of Threenes was lit by torches soaked in pine resin that burned orange and smelled of char. And the combined light of 40 such torches made the space look less like a seat of power, and more like the inside of something that had already been burned. My advisors did not seem to notice. They arrived in their ordered sequence, the steward first, walking with the careful precision of a man who had learned that small predictabilities kept him safe. Then the high priest Orvonos, whose eyes I had never seen in 40 years of counsel, because they were perpetually aimed at the floor in what he called reverence, and I called something more honest. Then the generals, then the magistrates, then the lesser functionaries who existed primarily to make the room seem full. None of them looked at me. This was the custom. This was, in fact, the law. Looking directly at the Serpent Queen, this was the formal title. Though I had stopped insisting on it after the 1st century, was classified in the legal texts of Threenes as an act of aggression. The penalty was stone, not imprisonment, not exile, stone. The transformation was permanent, irreversible, and I had not invoked it in 11 years. But the threat of it was what made the room function. Every lowered eye, every carefully averted gaze, every hand placed carefully over the face, when a petition required proximity, all of it was the architecture of my power. Built not on love, not on justice, on the simple primal knowledge that I curse would grant if I chose to. I had not chosen to in 11 years, but they did not know that. And I had not corrected the impression. General Krian arrived last, as he always did. A small dominant I had permitted him for 15 years, the last arrival implying unhurried importance. He was a large man with a jaw like a cliff face, and hands that looked engineered for grip, rather than gesture. He had served 3 campaigns for the crown of Threnes, and won all 3. And he wore the victories the way some men wear old injuries, not as trophies but as foundational facts. Things without which his skeleton would not hold its shape. He took his place at the far end of the great table and directed his gaze at the space 6 inches to my left. The usual location, the harvest assessment, I said. The steward read the numbers. They were bad. The 43 days of cloud cover had wilted the grain in the lower fields, and the root vegetables had come up pale and stunted, stripped of whatever it is that sunlight teaches food to be. The eastern provinces were reporting shortfalls. There was a town called Merith, 3 days from the capital, where the children had started eating the seed, stock meant for spring planting, which was the particular kind of desperation that precedes catastrophe in ways that tend to be invisible until they are not. Redistribute from the northern stores, I said. The northern stores are allocated against the military campaign, Krian said, to the space left of my face. Reallocate them. A pause, brief but textured with something I recognized as resistance, shaped into the form of protocol. The campaign schedule. The children of Merith are eating seed stock, I said. There will be no campaign if there is no kingdom. The table was silent. Orvanos moved his lips in something that might have been prayer or might have been calculation. The steward made a note on his wax tablet with the focused attention of a man ensuring he would never be asked to testify about what happened in this room. Krian said nothing more. He did not agree. He simply stopped disagreeing, which in my court was the same thing. This was how the morning's business was conducted. This was how all mornings were conducted. And it might have continued indefinitely. The torchlight, the averted eyes, the architecture of productive terror, if the door at the far end of the hall had not opened at the wrong time. The guard who opened it was already apologizing before he had finished the gesture. His body angled sideways in the particular posture of a man who understands he has made an error and is hoping the angle of his spine will mitigate the consequences. Behind him, having pushed past his considerable mass, with the confidence of someone too young to understand what confidence costs, was a child. She was perhaps 7 years old, perhaps 8. Her dress was the rough linen of the agricultural provinces, woven for durability, dyed with cheap plant matter that had faded to an indeterminate color somewhere between brown and the memory of brown. Her feet were bare and dirty, and one knee showed where she had fallen, the clay of the courtyard still damp on her skin. Her hair was dark and had been braided once, perhaps this morning, but several inches of it had escaped the braid and stood out around her face at irregular angles, giving her the look of someone mid-thought. She stopped when she saw me. The room, to its credit, held its breath. Every person in that hall had been trained by years of protocol and proximity to keep their eyes carefully anywhere but my face. They did it reflexively now, without thought, the way the body breathes. But this child, this barefoot, clay-kneed, escaped braid child, looked directly at me with the uncomplicated directness of someone who had not yet been taught the rule. Her eyes were brown with flecks of amber that caught the torchlight. I noticed this because I was looking back. I am not certain when I last looked back at anyone. She did not turn to stone. This, too, was information. I filed it carefully. "Who are you?" I asked. "Lyra," she said, without hesitation or honorific, the way children state their names, not as introduction but as fact. "My father is in your prison. He didn't steal the grain." The magistrate lied. The silence that followed had a different quality from the usual silence of my court. Usual silence was shaped like obedience. This silence was shaped like the moment before something falls. Creon's jaw moved. Orvanos, despite himself, let his eyes drift upward half an inch before catching the movement and dragging them back to the floor. The steward's stylus stopped moving. "Which magistrate?" I said, "Calderon, from Merith." The town where children were eating seed stock. The magistrate who had reported the harvest shortfall. I considered the shape of this for a moment, the particular geometry of a man in power who invents a thief to explain what he himself has taken. "How did you get past the gates?" I asked. She blinked. "I told them my father was innocent." "And they let you in?" "No," she said. "But the space between the third and fourth gate bar is wide enough if you're not too big." She paused, then added, with the scrupulous honesty of childhood, "I tore my dress." I looked at her for a long moment. She looked back, not with bravado, not with fear, with the direct, uncomplicated attention of a child examining something interesting, a bird, a beetle, an unfamiliar fruit. She was trying to understand what she was seeing. It had not occurred to her to be afraid of the understanding. I had not been looked at like that in longer than I could clearly remember. Something shifted in my chest, not painfully, but with the specific quality of a lock, turning after years of disuse. A small, internal click. "Bring me the file on the Merith magistrate," I said to the steward. "And bring the prisoner. What is your father's name?" "Davin," she said. "Davin of Merith." "Bring the prisoner Davin to the preparation room. Do not harm him." The steward was moving before I finished the sentence. Grateful, I suspected, for a clear task in an unclear moment. The guard shifted. The court began the careful, orchestrated motion of an institution redirecting itself. Lyra had not moved. She was still looking at me. "You should be afraid," I said. I did not mean it as a threat. I meant it the way one might warn a child about standing too close to the edge of something, a well, a cliff, a fact requiring acknowledgement. She considered this with genuine seriousness. "Are you going to hurt me?" "No." "Then I don't need to be afraid," she said, with the merciless logic of the very young. "Fear is for when something bad is going to happen." I thought of 11 years of averted eyes, of legal statutes written around my gaze, of the farmers who crossed to the opposite side of the road when my procession passed, of the merchants who hung protective symbols above their stalls, of the children of this very kingdom who were told stories about me at bedtime, not to comfort them, but to ensure they understood what distance meant. "Many people disagree with you," I said. "Many people," she said, with the unearned authority of someone who has been alive for 7 or 8 years, "are wrong about a lot of things." The door at the far end opened again. It was Orvanos, suddenly finding purpose in motion, gesturing for the guard to escort the child somewhere, a side room, a waiting area, anywhere that was not here. Because here had become something that no one in this court had language for. Lyra went without argument. But at the door, she turned back once and looked at me again. That same clear, unguarded look, the one that contained no strategy and no terror, just attention, and then she was gone. The torches continued to burn. The smoke drifted upward. Every person in the room carefully did not look at each other, because to look at each other would have been to acknowledge that something had changed, and none of them were yet prepared to understand what. But I knew. The child had looked at me and seen a person, not a monster, not a law, not a weapon or a warning or a myth given flesh. A person, and the specific horror of this, the reason my hands, folded on the arm of the throne, had tightened without my instructing them to, was not that she had been wrong. It was the possibility, arriving cold and precise as a blade between ribs, that she might have been right. And somewhere in this court, in this kingdom, someone had noticed what Lyra had done. Someone with much older eyes and much longer plans was already deciding what her fearlessness meant, not for her. For them, what was written in the magistrate's file. And what it connected to that went far beyond one stolen harvest. That was the question I had not yet thought to ask. But it was already moving toward me, through corridors I could not see. The file on Magistrate Caldron of Merith was 43 pages long and told me almost nothing for the first 37 of them. This is often how truth hides, not in the absence of documentation, but in its abundance. 43 pages of harvest tallies, tax records, legal proceedings, petitions filed and dismissed. Caldron had held the office for 9 years. Before that, 8 years as deputy magistrate under a man who had died of unremarkable causes. Before that, a military service record spanning the second campaign, where his name appeared on 3 different troop lists, all under the same commanding general. The name of that general was Crean. I set down page 37 and read page 38. With a different quality of attention. The grain that had been reported stolen from the Merith public store was not. According to the original intake records, the quantity Caldron had reported missing. The discrepancy was small enough to pass unnoticed in ordinary audit, a matter of 12 versus 15 bushels per household. Allocation, but applied across the 400 families of the Merith district. It accumulated into something significant, into the precise quantity, in fact, that would comfortably feed a regiment for 2 weeks of march. I thought about the campaign, the northern stores I had just reallocated, the schedule that Crean had defended with unusual intensity for a man who spent most of his time studying the space to the left of my face. I sent for Davin of Merith. He arrived in the preparation room having clearly expected something worse than a conversation. There was a quality to his stillness. When the guards brought him through the door, that spoke of a man who had been rehearsing his own ending. He's perhaps with the lean, weathered construction of someone who works soil for a living. And his hands always, having watched so many people refused to use them to look at me. His hands were those of a man who actually farmed, not one who directed others to. The calluses were in the right places. He did not look at me directly. Years of instinct, probably. Rural people absorbed the legends more completely than city people, who had at least the buffer of irony. "Sit down," I said. He sat. "Tell me about the grain." He told me. He told me with the specificity of a man who has been trying to get someone to listen. For months, and has given up expecting it will work, and so has refined the telling to its barest necessary bones. 12 bushels, not 15. His neighbor Sira had kept her own count. 3 other families had noticed. When Caldron announced the shortage and named Davin as the thief, Davin, who had been seen near the granary at the wrong time by the wrong person, which turned out to be Caldron's own cousin, There had been no process. No evidence examined. A magistrate's word was sufficient in Merith, apparently, for a verdict, an arrest, and the confiscation of property. The confiscated property included Davin's small farm, which had been transferred, within the week, to Caldron's cousin. I looked at this man who had come expecting stone and was getting a conversation. And I thought about his daughter, squeezing through the gap between the third and fourth gate bar because the space was wide enough, if you weren't too big. And I thought about all the things children do when they have run out of other options. Your daughter is safe, I said. She's in the east courtyard. Something happened to his face then. Not relief. Exactly. The emotion was too large and too complex for a single word. It was more like the specific expression of a person who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has just been told they can set it down. And isn't certain their arms remember how. She found you, he said. She found me, I confirmed. He almost looked up, caught himself, looked at the table instead with an expression I recognized as gratitude shaped by fear, which is the most common expression in my kingdom and the one I find most difficult to look at without something cold moving through me. She looked at me, I said. Without fear. He did look up then, briefly, reflexively, pulled upward by something stronger than instinct, parental attention. Maybe the particular alertness of a person being told information about their child. He caught my eyes for less than a second before the training of a lifetime in this kingdom pulled his gaze back down, but it was enough. She doesn't know, he said quietly. I never told her what that meant. What looking at you? He stopped, regrouped. She was born after the last enforcement. She's only heard stories. And she was always the kind of child who decided stories needed verification. I thought about that. A child who decided stories needed verification. A child who looked at the monster and found an old woman on a stone seat. A child whose father was in prison for grain he did not steal. Grain that was building toward something I was beginning to understand more clearly with each page I had read. Who else has Caldron arrested in the last 2 years? I asked. The steward, who was present and had been making himself as small as possible against the far wall, began shuffling through his papers with the slightly panicked efficiency of a man who's going to be Levan Piopli. All from the Merith district and the 2 adjacent territories. All accused of property crimes. All convicted on Caldron's testimony or that of people in Caldron's employ. All farms and small holdings subsequently transferred to a network of buyers that, when I looked at it mapped on parchment, resolved itself into a pattern with an obvious shape. A corridor, a march route, the most efficient land path between the northern military stores and the eastern border where the campaign was supposed to be headed. Someone was clearing the land. Someone was acquiring passage rights by proxy, through a magistrate, through false accusations, through the legal mechanism of my own kingdom. Someone was building infrastructure for a military movement that had not been authorized by the crown. Leave us, I said to the steward. He left with grateful speed. I sat across from Davin of Merith and considered how to say what I needed to say next, which was something I had not said to a private citizen in quite a long time. I need your help, I said. Linked. Your daughter walked into my court and started a process that I think is going to become larger than either of us planned. I need someone who knows the Merith territory, who has personal knowledge of the families affected, who can identify which of the other people Caldron arrested have farms that fit the pattern I'm looking at. I paused. I need someone who has reason to care whether I get this right, He was quiet for a long moment. His hands, those farmer's hands with the calluses in the right places, moved slightly on the table, not toward anything, just the movement of a man thinking through his hands. "What happens to my daughter?" he said finally, "if this gets larger than planned?" It was the right question. I respected him immediately for asking it. "She stays in the palace until it resolves," I said. "Under my protection." "Under your protection," he repeated. And I heard in his voice the very precise calculation of a man weighing what that meant: the protection of the thing this entire kingdom feared, the sanctuary of the monster, the shelter of the creature who made thrones tremble, and deciding whether that protection was worth more or less than what he currently had, which was an empty farm and a prison cell. "Yes," I said, "under mine." He looked at the table for another long moment. Then he said, "Caldron isn't acting alone. I know that much. There are two other men who visit him, not local men. The farmers talk. We notice strangers. Can you describe them?" "One is very tall. Scar across the left hand, not a work scar, a blade scar. The other is shorter, rounder, wears good boots for someone who claims to be a traveling merchant." Good boots for someone who claims to be a traveling merchant. I thought about Creon's court, about the functionaries who served as his eyes in the distant provinces, about the administrative machinery of a military man who had spent 15 years being very patient. "Davin," I said, "when was the last time Caldron visited the capital?" He thought, 6 weeks ago. He came for what he said was a routine administrative review. 6 weeks ago. 7 weeks before the campaign was scheduled to begin. Long enough to finalize arrangements. Short enough to be deliberate. The steward returned at the 4th hour with the thing I had sent him to find. The actual text of the Merith Property Ordinance, in its original form, before the administrative revisions of 8 years ago. In the 3rd subsection of the 6th clause, in language so dense with qualifier and cross-reference that it had clearly been written to be unread. Someone had inserted 2 sentences that did not belong. Those 2 sentences established that under specific conditions, a declared emergency, shortage, and a magistrate's ruling of civil necessity, the Crown's first refusal rights on requisitioned property could be waived in favor of a designated secondary receiver. That receiver was referenced only by an administrative code number which, when traced through the archives, resolved to a trust registered under agents of the compact. I had not heard those words in 11 years. The last time someone in my court used them. They had been speaking about the peace agreement that ended the 3rd campaign, Creon's campaign. The compact had been, on paper, a document about grain allocations and border arrangements. I understood now, with the cold clarity that comes when suspicion is confirmed by evidence, that it had never been about grain at all. It had been about controlling the land corridor between the northern stores and the eastern border. About building, slowly and methodically across years, the infrastructure for something the 3rd campaign had failed to accomplish by force. Creon had not been waiting 15 years out of loyalty. He had been building. And a child from Merith, his farmer's daughter with clay on her knees and amber in her eyes, had just walked through the gap in the gate bars and told me everything without knowing there was anything to tell. I had 3 days. 3 days before the grain transfer was finalized, and Creon understood what I knew. I needed to move before he did, and I needed to decide, before I moved, what I was willing to destroy to protect a child who had looked at me without fear, and whether I was certain the protections I was offering were actually mine to give. I gave them the hour together that followed. I watched from the high window, not secretly, not with any calculated intention, but because the window was there and the courtyard was below. And I found myself standing at the glass before I had decided to. Davin and Lyra sat on the low stone bench beside the courtyard fountain, which had not run properly into seasons because the mechanism feeding it from the eastern cistern had corroded and I had not yet prioritized the repair. One of those small deferrals that accumulate in the governance of a long reign, each individually justifiable, collectively amounting to a dry basin and the particular silence of something that should be making sound. Lyra was talking. I could not hear the words at this distance, but her hands moved in the animated geometry of someone describing something very large with instruments built for smaller things. Davin held still. His hands, those calloused farming hands, were wrapped around his daughter's smaller ones, not gripping, just holding. The contact of a man who needed to confirm at the cellular level that what he was touching was real. At one point, he pulled her against him and held the back of her head with his palm. And she let him, which is not something children do easily, unless they understand something is being communicated that exists below the level of words. I turned away from the window. I had governed alone for a very long time. My reign had operated for so long at the remove that my gaze enforced that I had forgotten what it was to simply witness. People, not performing, not appealing, not carefully managing their proximity to consequence, but simply being. Father and daughter in a dry courtyard, retrieving each other after 14 weeks of separation. The rooms of my chest, long cold, remembered something about warmth in a way that made the previous cold retroactively complete. Orvanos found me an hour later in the map room, where I had spread every land survey from the Merith corridor going back 20 years. He entered the way he always entered, eyes at the floor, body angled at 45 degrees. The posture of a man who had calcified his deference into identity. There are people asking questions, he said, about the child, about what her presence here means. Who is asking? His silence told me more than his answer would have. The general is asking, so Krian already knew. Of course he did. 15 years of patience did not accumulate in a man who did not have very good ears in very many rooms. He would have felt the nudge, the slight displacement of gears that had been turning in one direction and had now been disturbed. The child had looked at me, I had looked back, and in that bilateral act of attention, something in the machinery of this court had shifted. I needed to act before he understood how much I knew. And I needed Lyra somewhere he could not reach. Which meant, for the first time in 11 years, I needed the full weight of my power to be something other than a threat. I needed it to be a wall. The order I issued at the 6th bell that evening was not dramatic. This is important to understand about the way real power moves. It does not arrive in speeches and drawn swords. It arrives in ink on paper, delivered by a runner whose boots are quiet on stone floors. Received by a recipient who reads it once and then sits very still for a long time. The order revoked Magistrate Caldron's appointment, effective immediately. It also initiated proceedings under the Crown's legal restoration, protociolar, rarely used but entirely valid mechanism by which the land transfers could be reviewed, contested, and, where fraud was established, reversed. I had the steward drafted in for copies before the 6th bell finished ringing, which meant by the time the 7th bell rang. One copy was already on its way to Merith by mounted courier. I did not send the one to Krian. Not yet. I let him discover it the way a spider discovers a broken strand in its web, by the absence of tension where tension had been. What I did not fully calculate was the speed of that discovery. Creon requested an audience at the 8th bell, which in the schedule of my court was the hour reserved for military matters. A coincidence that I strongly suspected was not coincidental. He arrived with 2 of his senior officers, which was unusual and technically a breach of protocol. Private audiences were private, but I did not challenge it because I wanted to see what configuration he had decided to present himself in. The 2 officers were not for intimidation, they were witnesses. He was, very carefully, managing the official record. He entered and took his position at the standard distance and directed his gaze, as always, to the space 6 inches to my left. The grain reallocation, he said, without preamble, has been executed, I said. The children of Merith will eat. The campaign is postponed. The silence that followed had a different quality from every previous silence in that room. The previous silences had been shaped by the knowledge of what I could do, the weight of unexercised power, the pressure of potential consequence. This silence was shaped differently. It was the silence of a man recalculating, of a plan encountering a variable it had not accounted for. The campaign was approved, Creon said. His voice was level. This was a man who had spent 15 years moderating his voice in this room, and the practice had given him excellent control by the council 3 months ago. The council advises, I said. The crown decides. I have decided the campaign is postponed until the Merith investigation concludes. The Merith investigation. He said the words carefully. The way you say words you are hearing for the first time in a language you are pretending not to speak. What investigation? Into Magistrate Caldron's conduct, into the property transfers, into the administrative revisions made 8 years ago to the Merith Ordinance, and into the code number referenced in those revisions, and into the compact it points to. I paused. I have been reading your files, General. I find I have time for it, when the court is quiet. Something moved across his face then, not fear. Exactly. He was not a man accustomed to fear, or if he felt it, he had long ago learned to conduct it through channels where it was undetectable. What moved across his face was recognition. The particular expression of a man who has been operating under the assumption that he is alone in a room and has just understood that he is not. His 2 officers were very still. I served this throne for 30 years, Creon said. You served this throne for 15, I said. Before that, you served the compact. The first officer's hand moved. A small movement, not toward a weapon, not explicitly, but the involuntary motion of a body responding to a shift in the situation before the mind has caught up to what the shift means. I looked at him, directly, the full weight of my gaze, unmediated, complete. He turned to stone. The sound was not what stories make it out to be. There was no crack, no dramatic transformation. It was more like the sudden absence of breath from a room, a specific quality of stillness that you could feel in the air pressure. The way the room knew, at some cellular level, that it contained one fewer living thing. The officer stood exactly where he had been standing, in exactly the posture he had occupied when my eyes found him. He would stand there until someone moved him. The second officer had closed his eyes the moment he understood what was happening. Very quickly, professional reflexes. Creon had not moved. He was, I realized, looking at me. Not at the space to my left. At me, directly. The first time, in 15 years, that he had done so. His eyes were grey, I noted, the grey of stones under moving water, the color of something that has been worn smooth by patience and time. He was looking at me with the expression of a man who has made a very long calculation and is now waiting for the answer to arrive. The child, he said, is under my protection. She was not sent to you, he said. I want you to know that. Whatever you think, she was not sent. Her father is exactly what he appears to be, a farmer, a wrongfully imprisoned man. He paused. Some of what Calderon did was mine. Some of it was not. The child is not mine. I had not expected this. I had expected denial, misdirection. The carefully maintained architecture of a man who had spent 15 years building something and would not give it up easily. What I had not expected was this: a general, in a room with a stone officer and a living witness, choosing to look at me directly and tell me a truth he did not have to tell. Why? I said. Are you telling me this? He was quiet for a long moment. Something happened behind those water-stone eyes, something I could not fully interpret, which was unusual for me. I had been reading people for a very long time, because the child looked at you, he said finally, and the throne trembled. And something that has not moved in 40 years moved. And I have been running calculations for 24 hours on what that means. And every version of the calculation arrives at the same answer, which is that what I built was built on a premise that is no longer true. He looked away, finally, back to the wall, back to the trained deflection of years. The premise was that you would never look back. I had not expected that either. The second officer was breathing through his nose in the controlled, deliberate rhythm of a man who has decided that very careful stillness is his best available strategy. The stone officer stood among them. The torches burned. Somewhere in the east wing, in a room I had assigned for the purpose, a child with amber in her eyes was sleeping in a bed that was probably too large, and certainly too formal, and in which she was likely sleeping anyway, with the pragmatic totality that children apply to rest, when rest is available. The compact, I said. What was it actually for? He told me. He told me in a flat, precise voice without apparent emotion, the way a general reads a battle report, not because he felt nothing, but because he had learned, over 30 years of military life, that the information was more valuable than the feeling. And the feeling would come later, when there was time for it. The compact had been, originally, a genuine peace arrangement. He wanted me to know that, seemed to need me to know that, which told me something about what kind of man he actually was beneath the architecture of the plan. The first 3 years of it had operated exactly as stated. And then, gradually, one conversation at a time, one administrative adjustment at a time, it had become something else, something with momentum, something that kept growing because it had already grown. Because the alternative was to dismantle years of patient work and account for all of it. And accounting for it meant consequences of the kind that ended careers and possibly lives. He had not stopped it when he should have. He knew that. He had told himself, for 8 years, that the moment was not yet right. That stopping it now would cause more damage than letting it continue slightly longer. And this particular lie, the lie of the better moment, just ahead, had carried him from a man who had made a mistake into a man who had made a career of it. The campaign, I said. Where was it actually going? Not east. I've been looking at the corridor you built. North, he said. To the old capital, to the seat of the compact's original power. He paused. To remove the throne entirely. There it was. Not a border campaign. A coup. A slow, methodical, legally architected coup. Built over 15 years of grain allocations and property transfers and a military man who had practiced looking at the wall to my left, while he quietly dismantled the foundations under my feet. And it had been uncovered not by intelligence, not by counterintelligence, not by years of careful surveillance. It had been uncovered by a 7-year-old girl who had looked at me without fear because she didn't know she was supposed to be afraid, and whose clear, uncomplicated gaze had shaken something loose that had been calcifying for decades, and whose father had mentioned grain discrepancies with the specificity of a man who actually counted things, and who had, between them, given me the single morning of genuine attention that had broken 43 pages of careful concealment. I looked at Krian for a long time. He did not look back. His gaze was fixed, somewhere in the middle distance, the particular location of a man who has said the unsayable and is now waiting to see what the world does with it. "I am not going to turn you to stone," I said. He was very still. "I am going to give you a choice. You will spend the next month providing the steward with every detail of the compact. Names, dates, transactions, the full architecture, every person involved, every document altered, every farm wrongfully seized, and the legal mechanism for its return. You will do this completely and accurately, because I will be checking it against what I already have, and any gap I find will change my assessment of your usefulness." I paused. "In exchange, the second campaign, your actual career, your actual service, the campaigns you actually fought for this throne, will be the record. The rest will be handled administratively, quietly, without your name in the public account." He was quiet for a very long time. Long enough that the second officer, still breathing carefully through his nose, began to look like he might run out of controlled breathing, and Calderon, Krian said. "Calderon will face the full legal weight of what he actually did," I said. "The rest is between this throne and the compact." Another silence. Then, the families in the corridor. "The ones whose farms were taken will be restored," I said. "Including Davin of Meris." He nodded. One small nod, precise and complete, the gesture of a military man acknowledging orders. Then he said something I had not expected and could not have predicted, and which I have thought about many times in the years since. He said, "I hope the girl stays curious." And then he looked at the floor, and the audience was over. The hours that followed were quieter, and quieter in a different way, not the silence of held breath, but the silence of something released. The stone officer stood in my great hall, already acquiring the quality of furniture that stone figures develop over time. Krian had left with the efficient quietness of a man who has made his arrangement and intends to honor it. I did not doubt him. There was something in the specificity of what he had told me, information volunteered beyond what was pressed, that spoke to the honesty of a person who has been carrying something too long and has decided to set it down. He was not a good man. The farms in the corridor were real. Davin's confiscated land. Lyra's 14 weeks, growing up with her father in a cell. These costs had been paid by real people, but he was not entirely what I had expected, either. In my long experience, almost no one is. I went to find the child. She was not in the room I had assigned her, the formal guest chamber with furniture built for state visitors. Entirely unsuitable for a girl who had spent her afternoon retrieving her father in a dry courtyard. I found her in the library, in the big chair by the south window, feet tucked under her, reading a treatise on Eastern agricultural practices with the concentrated attention of someone who had found something genuinely interesting. She did not look up when I entered, then did, with the unhurried quality of someone finishing their thought before acknowledging the interruption. "This says the eastern soil is good for something called Dyer's Weld," she said. "We don't grow that in Merith." Should we? I sat in the reading chair across from her. It depends on market demand. My father would know, she said practically. We sat for a while in the library's quieter light. At some point in the previous hours, the cloud cover had developed a fracture, not the dramatic clearing of 43 days, but a thin gold seam running through the iron-gray overcast, widening slowly. The room was warmer than it had been. I had not decided to lift the clouds. I had not made any internal declaration about mood or future. I had simply followed attention through rooms and documents, and one long conversation, until I arrived here. Watching a girl with her feet tucked up read about Dyer's Weld by the light of a sky that was beginning to remember the sun. There is a thing that happens when something blocking the light is moved. It does not require ceremony or decision. It simply happens. The light arrives, tentative and real, through the gap the removal created. The rooms that had been dark find they still remember what illumination is. They have been waiting, without language for the waiting, for something to shift. You see a great deal, I said. She looked up with the directness she brought to everything: the magistrate's fraud, the question of whether we were going home, the agricultural applications of Dyer's Weld. People forget to look at children, she said, so we see things. I thought about Creon's stonewater eyes looking at me directly for the first time in 15 years. I thought about my own hands tightening on the throne's arms in the moment I understood that this child was not afraid of me. I thought about 43 days of iron cloud, and the particular loneliness of a reign built on making sure no one ever looked back. Lyra, I said. She looked up from the agricultural treatise. Thank you. She considered this with her usual gravity. Then, you're welcome. You have very good books. And she went back to reading. The clouds continued, slowly, to open. Not because I commanded them to. Because something that had been in the way was no longer there, and once the obstruction moves, the light does not need to be invited. It simply comes. What I did not yet know, what was still moving toward me through corridors I could not see. Arriving not with drama, but with the quiet inevitability of all things that have been set in motion, was that removing. Creon, from the machinery of the compact, did not dismantle the compact itself. It had other architects. Some of them had been watching the throne room that morning from positions I had not identified. Some of them had seen what a child's clear eyes had done to a 15-year plan, and were already drawing different conclusions from the lesson than the ones I had drawn. They did not see a girl who had looked at a queen and found a person. They saw a vulnerability. They saw a crack in the architecture of something that had been impenetrable. And cracks, in the experience of people who build walls for purposes of power, are not something to mourn. They are places to put levers. The throne had trembled once. There were those for whom once was enough to know it could be made to tremble again. 3 weeks is not a long time to dismantle something that took 15 years to build. But 3 weeks was what I had, and I used every day of it. Creon's documentation was as complete as he had promised. He provided the names, not reluctantly, not with the practiced hesitation of a man searching for omissions, but with the flat, comprehensive specificity of a soldier filing a report. 23 people in the capital, 11 in the provinces, for in positions that would require careful, quiet extraction rather than direct legal action, because they were positioned in ways that made public exposure worse for the kingdom than for them, and I had lived long enough to know that the difference between justice and disruption is often a question of sequencing. I sequenced carefully. Calderon was first. His arrest was conducted by palace guard, rather than local militia, a deliberate choice. A signal to every magistrate in every province who had ever wondered how far Caldron's impunity reached. The signal was clear. It reached as far as Creon's protection, and Creon's protection had ended. The file that went with Caldron to the tribunal was not the sanitized version that would have satisfied a minimum standard of evidence. It was the complete version. The 11 prisoners, the false accusations, the property transfers, the code in the ordinance, all of it, public, documented, named. The tribunal took for days. Caldron did not attempt to deny it. This was, I suspected, not because he had run out of defenses, but because he had looked at the completeness of the file and performed the same calculation that Creon had performed in my throne room, the calculation of a man who understands that the shape of the evidence means the outcome is already determined, and that the only remaining question is what he wants the story of his conduct to be. He did not choose well. He attempted to implicate others who were not implicated, hoping to complicate the proceedings enough to buy time or leverage. 3 of the names he offered were invented. One was genuine but had already been documented by Creon's account. It accomplished nothing except to make his testimony less credible across the board, which is often what happens when desperation is used as a legal strategy. The tribunal found against him on 14 counts. He was sentenced to 20 years of supervised labor in the agricultural restoration project, the project that would, using confiscated funds from his own accounts, begin the process of returning the Merith Corridor farms to their rightful holders. I sat in the judgment seat for the sentencing and looked directly at him when the verdict was read, and he, with nowhere else to direct his gaze, looked back. I do not know what he saw. I know what I saw, a man who had made himself small in the service of something large, and had been, in the end, not even important enough to be the reason it fell. The families came home in stages. Davin of Merith was in the first group, practical, given that his farm was the case that had anchored everything. And I wanted the restoration to begin where the exposure had begun. He came to the palace on the morning of his departure to formally thank me, which was unnecessary, but clearly felt obligatory to a man for whom ceremony around gratitude was a form of accounting, a way of ensuring that the exchange was complete and nothing was owed. He arrived with Lyra, who had been in the palace for 3 weeks and had, during this time, read approximately 40 books, befriended the kitchen staff, discovered the palace's underground cistern system, and developed a detailed proposal for fixing the east courtyard fountain that she presented to the head groundskeeper with the thoroughness of someone who had given the matter serious thought. The groundskeeper had been sufficiently impressed that the repair was already partially underway. Davin stood in the preparation room, the same room where we had first spoken, with the same table and the same quality of light, and looked at the floor the way people look at floors in my presence, and said what he needed to say. Then he said something else, something he had not, I think, planned to say. But that rose up through the formality of the moment, the way truth sometimes rises, not because the moment invites it, but because it has been looking for a place to land. I want you to know, he said, to the floor, that she talks about you. I waited. She tells the other children at home about the queen who has snakes in her hair and very good books. She says, he stopped, started again. She says you were lonely. She said it to me one evening and then went back to her reading like it was a normal observation. And I have been thinking about it since. He finally looked up, briefly, the way he had in our first conversation, reflexively. Parentally, drawn up by something stronger than instinct. I don't know if that's true. I considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which was considerable. A child who decided stories needed verification had made an observation, and her father was delivering it to me with the careful gravity of a man who understood it might be important, even if he wasn't sure why. "She has better eyes than most adults," I said. He nodded. Then he picked up the document, the signed restoration of title to the Merith farm. The legal completion of everything that had begun with a child squeezing through a gap in the gate bars, and held it with both hands for a moment before tucking it into his coat. "Thank you," he said. "Whatever it was that happened here, whatever she started, thank you for following it." They left before the 9th bell. I watched from the same high window I had watched from 3 weeks earlier. When the fountain was dry and the sky was iron, the sky was different now, not brilliant, not the full clearing of accumulated dark, but genuinely lighter. The seam in the clouds had widened into a gap, and the gap had widened into something that could honestly be called sky, pale and cool and real, the blue of deep water viewed from above. The fountain in the courtyard was running. Not strongly, the repair was partial, the mechanism still needed work, but running. A thin sound of water in a stone basin, steady and small, filling the silence that had been there before with something that was not silence at all. I watched Lyra in the courtyard below, where she had stopped to look at the water. She stood with her head tilted slightly. The way she stood when she was thinking about something, considering its properties, its implications, its uses. Whether it was growing dyers, weld or fixing a broken fountain, or looking at a queen who was supposed to be terrifying, and finding instead someone who needed better light. Then she looked up, not at me, not directly. She couldn't have known I was at the window, but at the sky. At the pale, real, widening sky. And then Davin called her from the gate, and she turned and ran, barefoot on the stone, her braid coming half loose in the familiar way. And they walked out, through the gate and down the road that would take them home. I stood at the window for a long time after they were gone. The things I had lost in the previous 3 weeks were not small. The stone officer in my great hall was a person who had been alive and was now not. I had made that choice under pressure and with reason, and I did not doubt the reason. But I had been alive long enough and made enough irreversible choices to know that reason does not prevent weight. It simply explains it. He had been a man. He had a name. I did not know it, because I had never asked. And this was one of the specific costs of having governed so long from behind the barricade of enforced terror. I had stopped knowing the names of the people in my halls. That would change. It was a small thing in the accounting of a long reign. But it was also exactly the kind of small thing that, when you look at it clearly, without the barricade, with the uncomplicated attention that a child with amber in her eyes had modeled for me on a grey morning 3 weeks ago, turns out to be the thing that mattered most. The compact was not entirely dismantled. Krian's documentation was complete for what he knew, but the compact had always had architecture beyond what any single person knew. The others were still there, the ones who had watched the throne room from positions I had not identified. The ones who had drawn their own lessons from the sight of a 7-year-old girl uncovering 15 years of careful work with one clear, unafraid look. They were not done. They were thinking. They were drawing lines on maps and having conversations in rooms I could not see. And they were using the word I least wanted to hear in relation to this throne, vulnerable. They had seen the throne tremble. They had seen that, the thing which had kept it immovable for decades, the specific terror of my gaze. The architecture of avoidance, The law that made looking at me a sentence had been disrupted not by force, but by the absence of fear in a child who hadn't been taught it. And they were intelligent enough to understand what that meant, that the barricade I had maintained was not made of stone. It was made of habit, of stories told at bedsides, of laws that had not been tested for 11 years. Long enough that a child could be born and grow to reading age and never know the law was real. Habits can be broken, stories can be untold. Laws that are not tested start, eventually, to look optional. I had 3 months, I estimated. Perhaps 6, if the documentation from Korean was as thorough as I hoped and the extractions I had sequenced went cleanly. 3 to 6 months before the remaining architects of the compact concluded that what had been disrupted could be finished. And that finishing it would be easier now than it had been before. Because the queen, who had governed by terror, had revealed herself capable of something more complicated than terror. And complicated things, in the experience of people who traffic in power, are always more vulnerable than simple ones. The throne had trembled once, because truth arrived through a child's clear eyes. It would be tested again by those who had learned a different lesson from the same event. Not the lesson about looking. The lesson about what happens to things that can be moved. I was not afraid. I want to be clear about that. I was alert, which is different. Alert in the way that is not dread but readiness, the specific quality of attention that comes when you have stopped. Pretending that everything is fixed and have accepted that the world moves, that things change, that even thrones are not permanent, and that this knowledge is not a reason to stop sitting in them. I turned away from the window. The fountain made its thin, real sound below. The sky held its pale, tentative light. The library had 40 books, with my notes in the margins from the last 100 years. And somewhere in the province of Merith, a girl with her feet tucked under her and a braid that was already coming loose was going home. I sat down in the chair by the window, the reading chair, not the throne, and I thought about what it meant to govern a kingdom where some people, now, had stopped being afraid. I was not certain I knew how to do that. But I had spent the last 3 weeks learning that uncertainty, approached with attention rather than avoidance, tends to lead somewhere more interesting than certainty ever did. And I had, for the first time in decades, good reason to pay attention. She believed the throne's trembling was the end of something. She was right. But it was also une décision to look back. The way I was looking back now, the beginning of something else. Something she had started by doing nothing more than being curious, and being unafraid, and being exactly herself in a room that had spent 40 years trying to make sure no one ever was. She believed the throne's trembling was the end of something. She was right. But there were those who had watched from positions she couldn't see, who had drawn an entirely different lesson from what a child's fearless gaze had done to 15 years of careful architecture. They were not finished. They were already calculating. And what they were calculating was this: if the fear was a habit, and habits could be broken, then the throne was not protected by power at all. It was protected by a story. And stories, unlike stone, can be rewritten. If this story reached your heart, leave us a like and share it. What would you have done? And don't miss what comes next. Another memory Medusa never forgot.